haven't always defined academic objectives for my homeschooled kids, and that was a little bit of a mistake. Let's face it, we absolutely need those objectives defined so that we can narrow down curriculum choices and choose appropriate materials for our little students. But it's not always easy to know where to start or how to tailor those objectives to our kids' unique needs and interests. As an engineer turned homeschool mom, I'm always on the lookout for modern methods to help me fulfill my responsibilities as a homeschool parent. So, naturally, I became interested in seeing how ChatGPT could help me with this task of defining academic objectives. Okay, in case you don't know, ChatGPT is an AI language model trained on a massive amount of information, and it allows you to interact with it in a conversational way. And let me tell you, those conversations are surprisingly enjoyable. Maybe a little too enjoyable for me if we're being perfectly honest, but let's move on from that embarrassing admission and explore how ChatGPT can help us define academic objectives. We've discussed in the past offline methods of defining academic objectives, like the Core Knowledge series of books or the book Home Learning Year by Year. And I definitely recommend referring to something like that no matter what. I used both of these books to determine language arts academic objectives for my fourth grader. And here's what I came up with. So this is Good Notes, and this is a document where I put a few pages from my Homeschool Planning Decoded Starter Kit in order to do some of these planning activities and share it with you. So this is for my fourth grader, and I filled in this focus column right here by using the book Home Learning Year by Year and a little bit with the What Your Fourth Grader Needs to Know book from the Core Knowledge sequence of books. And so there are several line items from those books specifically, especially when you see areas like grammar, and I pull out a bunch of specific grammar concepts to cover or literature I pulled out of those books. There are some items like cursive. I can't remember if that was in the book or not, but I wanted us to cover cursive, and then also Bible and learning about Puerto Rico since I'm Puerto Rican, and I want for my kids and I all together to learn a little bit more about Puerto Rico. And those items obviously were not listed as academic objectives in these books, but these are areas that I wanted to have some focus. You'll see here areas like math and spelling and writing. I don't have a lot of detail in there because I already know what curriculum we're going to use for those. I trust the curriculum I'm using for each of these subjects and the academic objectives that it covers, so I wasn't going to waste time spelling things out there because I already know what we're going to do. Okay, a couple of things to point out. Notice language arts here is a big chunk of stuff. I didn't want to have just a language arts box here because, as you can see, for a fourth grader, for any grade, there's a lot to cover in language arts. So instead, I wanted to have line items for each of those specific areas of focus. Something else to point out is that the reason it took hours for me to fill in these 2 pages is because the books that I was using as reference in order to determine academic objectives have a lot of information in there about possible resources to use, and that's great. And I definitely took some of those ideas, so I had to add my reading log pages here in order to keep track of some of the books that stood out to me that we might possibly use. This isn't a final list of what we're going to use next year because I determined a book list later after I've worked on like what curricula we're going to use and what I need to cover with a book list. But because those books were there as I was determining academic objectives, I started filling this page in, and then that took me on rabbit trails for other resources. So I started looking at these magazines and how might I use those? Will I use the hard copy or will I get the app? I started looking at, see here my messy writing, since they had recommendations for resources, I thought, well, let me just start filling this in a little bit, even though, again, I don't do my curriculum plan until later in the planning process. I started filling in some ideas. I like the Stack the States app. And so it was just a very convoluted way to determine academic objectives. In my planning process, I prefer to do one thing at a time, determine academic objectives, and then move on to the rest. I know I could have used some willpower and not done all that, but it felt like I needed to. I can't describe it. Maybe it's just my inability to stay focused when there's talk of books and resources. But that's why it took me so long, because it wasn't a streamlined process to determine academic objectives. And so that's why I wanted to do this comparison with using a resource like ChatGPT, which will help me focus just on academic objectives, one thing at a time. Now let's go the modern route by using ChatGPT to determine objectives and compare. Let's focus on language arts since there's so much involved there. The first thing I want to do is assign ChatGPT a role, in this case as a homeschool curriculum advisor. ChatGPT has massive amounts of information available to it, so doing this helps to narrow down its focus to what's going to be most helpful to me. After assigning ChatGPT a role, I then ask it to get the specific information that I'm looking for. Right now, I want to know more about academic objectives for a particular grade and a particular subject. Now let's do a little bit of a comparison. I have here on the right the academic objectives form, and you see in blue the objectives that I defined using the home education books that I mentioned earlier. These objectives are unique to my particular child at this particular time. They're not for anyone else, and the objectives are based partly on my preferences, what I think is important for my child to cover, also on standard objectives for a child, his age, his grade, and then also on our local laws, what we're required to cover. So that's why these are going to be unique objectives. These aren't meant for you to take for your fourth grader and use with them. And then in red, we see here the differences I found between these objectives in blue and what's in ChatGPT. Why are there differences? Was it because this stuff in red wasn't in the home education books? Maybe, maybe not. Like I find it hard to believe that they didn't say verb tenses and capitalization should be covered in fourth grade. Probably did. Maybe I glossed over it when I went through the home education books because they are wordy and there's a lot of other information in there about resources and books to use. So I may have just glossed over it. Maybe it's because it was worded in a different way in the books and it just didn't stand out to me. Maybe it wasn't in the book. Maybe this thing about making predictions wasn't in either of the books that I read. I don't know. And I haven't gone back to look because I'm a little too lazy to do that right now. I'm just saying that I can see how it would be nice to have these two different methods of finding objectives that you use hand in hand to make sure that you're complete in the objectives you're defining. On this page, you can see that I have only the objectives that I cut and paste from ChatGPT. And they are nicely formatted. I may have gone in and deleted a couple of things that I felt weren't necessary or took out a few words here and there just to get the gist of it. But having it in this form and then being able to just copy and paste it over here, that is really nice. Notice that the focuses that ChatGPT gave me were not like I had with spelling and writing and cursive and literature. There are different objectives or focuses: reading comprehension, vocabulary, writing, grammar, and mechanics. This is okay, I think, if you want to use a language arts curriculum that's all integrated, where you just buy that one thing and it covers everything. This bulleted form allows you to compare with what the curriculum company says is covered in that curriculum. But if you're like me, and I think this is just a preference thing, if you're like me and you like to separate these areas of focus out and use just the right curriculum for each one, then this isn't going to be super helpful. So what I would do in that situation, and this is what I'm going to do next with my sixth grader, is here, you see up here in the prompt, I have language arts. Start with the following: language arts, fourth grade. Instead of the broad subject of language arts, I would replace language arts with grammar or literature or spelling or writing, whichever focus you're defining objectives for. So I'm going to try that with my sixth grader and share it with you. But first, let's look at a couple of other prompts that you may want to try depending on your situation and your homeschool. What if I homeschool using a particular educational philosophy and want to stick with that? Well, you can update the prompt like this. I'm going to start off with a classical education. I don't educate my kids classically, but I thought it'd be interesting to see what objectives we might see from ChatGPT for a language arts classical education. Again, we talk about oral communication, Literature and literary analysis. Classical education does rely a lot on literature. Research and information literacy. So we see here a few extra things from the original prompt that I used. Now let's see what it would say for a Montessori education. I'm not going to repeat the original prompt because I am staying in the same chat. Therefore, I can just continue the conversation, say something like, what about for a Montessori education? So we see here, we continue to focus on language arts because that's what we're discussing in this chat. It didn't go off into math and other items like that. Is it specific to Montessori? I do see that it talks about using hands-on materials and activities under grammar and sentence structure. It does talk about storytelling under writing skills. And so those are Montessori-esque ways of doing things. There might be other situations where you want to have a particular prompt. Let's say you're in a state that requires regular testing of your homeschooled students. So you may want to focus on academic objectives that will help your student succeed on standardized tests. I'm now asking ChatGPT to focus on reading objectives in order to do on standardized tests, and I'm using the chat with my original prompt. So let's see what happens now. So the formatting is a little bit funky with these lines there, but at least it is easy to read. So you see how you can tailor the prompt to reflect your homeschool's needs. In my homeschool, we don't stick with a particular educational philosophy. I don't need to worry about standardized tests. So I'm going to go back to the original response I got from ChatGPT and show you how you can change the formatting of this response. So instead of going back to the original prompt, what I ended up doing was starting a new chat. And I used the original prompt with a little bit of a modification, with a tweak. So here it says, I want you to act as a homeschool curriculum advisor, determine what a student's academic objectives might be for the particular subject they are studying, and then here's the difference, and present the information in a table with the columns academic objectives, description. Start with the following: language arts, 4th grade. All right, and so you see the response from ChatGPT is quite different. There are different categories of academic objectives for language arts than we had before in the original response. And that's just going to happen with ChatGPT. If you regenerate the response, it's going to try to do something different. Let me try that now. So you see here the new response. If I compare it with the previous response, we see the difference in academic objectives categories. I think this is actually really helpful because it's pulling, this is what I'm guessing is happening, that is pulling from different data sources to get this information. And then that helps me to get a more well-rounded idea of academic objectives. This is much easier to read. The information is summarized a bit more. And I find this to be helpful because then when you read the summary under description here, you can drill down more and ask more information about a particular academic objective instead of getting too much information at once. It helps you to kind of control the flow of information to you. As promised, I changed my process in order to get language arts academic objectives for 6th grade by getting objectives from ChatGPT first and then going back to my home education books. So I did it a little bit different though. I started off with my areas of focus for language arts, spelling, writing, grammar, literature. And then in ChatGPT, instead of asking for language arts objectives, I asked for first literature and reading objectives in order to fill in this area down here. And then I asked for grammar objectives. As with my 4th grader, I did that because I already know what I'm using for spelling and writing for my 6th grader next year. So that's already taken care of. But I do continue to keep these areas of focus in my academic objectives page in case there's anything I might miss. So for literature, I asked for the objectives and then I copied and pasted it here in red on the academic objectives worksheet and made some formatting changes and cut out some things I didn't think were needed, and then moved on to grammar and did the same thing here. And that was a pretty quick process. It took a few minutes for me to read through everything and see if there's any redundancy or anything that I didn't want to keep, or for me to word things in a different way. Then I went back to the books, and what you see in blue are what I added from looking at the books. And you can see there's really not much. It was a pretty quick process since I had this very nicely formatted list of objectives here. It really did help me to stay focused when I looked at the home education books and be able to skip past the resources and other suggestions contained in the books. So it was a very quick process. I did look at spelling and writing and added a couple of things there that the curriculum isn't covering so that I can supplement in some way for those few items if I so choose. And it was a pretty quick process. It was dramatically faster than what I did with my fourth grader, where I went to the home education books first and had to make up my own list and edit it down and then go to ChatGPT and compare. It was a dramatically faster process to use ChatGPT first and then go to the home education books. And using them hand in hand, I feel really good about the results. And using ChatGPT first, I feel really good about how fast it was. The nice thing about using something like GoodNotes to do this is that I was able to also just add on pages to this document and copy and paste this whole thing and just include it here. I also regenerated at one point, and I can include both copies of what ChatGPT gives. Isn't that great? I'm really pleased with how this is working out. All right, so let's continue on now. I love that I can get ChatGPT to present the information to me in a way that makes sense to me, and then just copy and paste it to a document for future reference. Isn't that awesome? Okay, so those are ways to get general objectives for a specific grade. But the reality of homeschooling is that our kids may not always fit into the traditional grade level expectations. Grade levels are a construct that don't always work for every child, especially when it comes to choosing curricula. For subjects like math and language arts, I've always wanted an overview of a clear path of mastery for my children, regardless of their age or grade level, because they would progress down that path at their own pace. It would also serve as a clear roadmap for me to follow to define academic objectives and fill in learning gaps. I think I can create something like this with ChatGPT. Let's try it out. Well, I was successful in creating the learning path I was hoping for. Let me show you how I did it. So first of all, I used this prompt. It says, "You are a veteran elementary school teacher and expert in early education. Generate a table outlining how students should progress through typically recommended academic language arts objectives from kindergarten to 6th grade. The table should include rows for grade levels, kindergarten through 6th grade, and columns for reading, writing, grammar, spelling, handwriting, and literature." So I got this table from ChatGPT. I regenerated a couple of times just to see what I would get, and my favorite ended up being this third one because it seemed to have the most complete information. Notice that the column contains kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, which is what I asked for. But since, as I said, these grade levels are a construct, I didn't want to get bogged down in what grade someone should be doing something. And so because of that, I thought, well, let me just replace this grade level text with year 1, year 2, year 3. So that's what I said. I said replace the grade levels kindergarten through 6th grade with the text year 1 through year 7. And I realized this may be confusing since, like in the UK, you do use terminology year 1, year 2. But here in the United States, I'm just trying to get rid of the idea of what we typically call the grade levels so that I wouldn't be caught up in that. And so it just gave me that same, as far as I can see, it's the same table, it's just with this text changed. After I got the table the way I wanted it, I copied it into a document in order for it to be useful to me. So I just start here, go all the way to the right to get everything, and then go all the way to the bottom. And I copied it in, for me, I'm on a Mac, so I copied it into Pages. And let me show you what I came up with. So I copied it into this document, and in Pages, it copied it as a table, which I like. And then I just reformatted it. I made the text smaller, centered some things, moved the document into landscape mode instead of portrait mode so it would all fit on this one page. Added a title, and there you have it. It's a one-page cheat sheet for academic objectives for me for elementary school. I could have also changed the prompt to give me objectives for kindergarten through 8th grade maybe, so I cover elementary and middle school. But I'm happy with this for right now. And then I just exported it to PDF so that I could import it into GoodNotes. I would also go back and double check with other sources to make sure that this is good. I am not an expert in elementary school education, but as a homeschool mom who has been homeschooling for 8 years, and I have 3 kids, and my youngest is now in 4th grade, from my quick glance through this looked pretty good to me. This looked helpful to me. It's something nice for me to refer back to. But of course, always check your local laws and maybe the academic objectives defined by your state to see if this lines up nicely with the local requirements that you have. That way you have a really nice document that's helpful to you and you're not having to kind of reinvent the wheel every year. For me, the way I want to use this is to look through, especially grammar, always an area of struggle for us. I want to just start off actually with year 1 and make sure that my students, especially my rising 4th grader, that he's in a good place with these grammar objectives, learning objectives from the previous years before we continue on with the others, or it at least help me to identify places to remediate. So that's my plan for the use of this table in order to get out of the thinking of grade levels and more into progressing down a learning path so that my kids have some mastery of the subject. ChatGPT is great for helping you do research, but not for doing all of your thinking for you. You're still accountable for defining appropriate objectives for your kids. This is just a tool to hopefully help speed up and streamline the process. Once you have your academic objectives in place, it's time to use them to find just the right homeschool curricula. So watch my next ChatGPT video to see how I do that if you want to save time. I'll see you there.